Howdy, I'm Kate Kavanaugh, and you're listening to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, where we're laying the groundwork for our land, ourselves, and for generations to come by looking at the way every thread of life is connected to one another. Communities above ground mirror the communities below the soil, which mirror the vast community of the cosmos. As the saying goes, as above, so below. Join me as we take a curious journey into agriculture, biology, history, spirituality, health, and so much more. I can't wait to unearth all of these incredible topics alongside you. Hello, and welcome to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast that is ever so slowly transitioning to the groundwork podcast as I get my stuff together. I am your host, Kate Kavanaugh, and it is such a pleasure to be here with you each and every week, exploring the threads of what it means to be humans woven into this earth. I have an episode that I am so excited about, especially as we start in on the dry season here in the United States, at least for those of my listeners that are in the West. My guest this week is Jay Owens, whose book, Dust, The Modern World in a Trillion Particles, really impacted me. As I was going back over my notes for the show, I couldn't believe how many quotes I've pulled from Jay and her work. And I know that I was really genuinely nervous for this episode because I just think that Jay has written a book that is about so many different pieces of our modern landscape, including what modernity itself is and might mean. And in Jay's words, dust is actually a lot about water because dust in itself is about the absence of water. And those of you that have been longtime listeners will know that exploring issues related to water is near and dear to my heart. I wanted to start us off with a quote from Jay that I didn't get to recount in the podcast. At least I think I didn't. It's been a minute. But either way, it's good to really drive this home. Jay says, "So what might a dusty problem entail? A problem of one sort, a challenge to economic growth, has been solved by creating another problem, one that can be more easily brushed under the carpet, denied, ignored, or displaced as somebody else's responsibility. It's slow, taking at least decades to build and decades to resolve, if this happens at all. The problem operates on difficult to govern scales, probably very small and very large at the same time. And it contains positive and interlocking feedback loops. So it's a dynamic and unpredictable problem. There's the possibility of tipping points and phase change consequences where the problem goes from bad to calamitous in a blink. A dusty problem definitely does not operate within standard political boundaries or election cycles, making it particularly tricky to act upon and sort out. And above all, a dusty problem is an environmental injustice where the people who have caused the problem aren't the ones dealing with its consequences." I really loved exploring dust with Jay. Like I said, it encompasses an aspect of looking at water, looking at the very idea of modernity and what that means, looking at incredibly complex feedback loops that we can't even begin to understand, right? And I think that this is really encapsulated for me in the idea that we have a sort of dust cycle, right? The dust from the African Sahara fertilizes tropical rainforests in the Amazon. It feeds phytoplankton in the ocean. It melts snow and changes the albedo. It helps form clouds. It heats, it cools, it does all of these different things that are deeply interconnected with one another, and yet it is unseen. It is the thing that gathers on these smooth modern surfaces that we want to wipe away, that we want to sweep under the rug. And so in that, I think it really encapsulates all these different aspects that we've been exploring of interconnectedness and unseen and away. The book is incredible. It starts as a history of looking at water rights in the Owens Valley in California, and it then travels across space and across time to look at the drying up of the Aral Sea in Turkmenistan. It goes all across different aspects of nuclear testing in New Mexico, looking at dust in ice cores in the Arctic. And Jay writes it with a really beautiful prose that is at times poetic and is at times a great call to action for what it means to be right here at the peak of what, well, I wouldn't call it the peak, but some would call it the peak and some would call it modernity. And I just think it's fantastic, and I can't say enough good things about it. So I really hope that you will pick up Dust, the Modern World in a Trillion Particles, and explore it a little bit more for yourself. As for a little bit of housekeeping this week, if you enjoy this podcast and you want to help support it, one of the best ways to do that is to just hit the subscribe button and leave a rating. And if you're listening in Apple Podcasts, a review. That really helps others find the podcast and gives it that certain flavor of people knowing that others enjoyed it. So please share what you enjoy about this podcast in a little review. And if you do so, I'm happy to send you a piece of mail. Just take a snapshot of your review and send it to me in DMs or in my email. I want to give a big thank you to Rob Kropfel and Jillian Lakuski, who are sponsoring this episode of the show with their Sundries Farm Garlic, which is back on sale for shipping in September for their seed and culinary garlic starts. We'll have a really fantastic little story in this episode about Sundries Farm coming up. Thank you again for listening to the podcast. I can't wait for all the explorations that we have coming up. And without further ado, here is Jay Owens. This episode of the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast is brought to you by Sundries Farm Garlic. You can find their incredible seed and culinary garlic that is packed full of flavor with nice big cloves at sundriesfarm.com. That's SUNDRIESFARM.com. And you can pre-order their seed and culinary garlic for shipping beginning in September. You know, it's funny. As I was thinking about this book, I feel in many ways that a lot of the conversations that I've had on the podcast have been circling the idea of dust without really touching it, whether we've been talking about desertification or topsoil erosion or talking about water or sand or all of the whirrings and machinery of capitalism. I think that in many ways that it was something that that I hadn't seen that I was speaking about. And I would love for you to introduce dust because I think that it is something that is both, it's so paradoxical and slippery in its nature that it is ubiquitous but not seen. And it is everywhere, but it goes unnoticed. And it is incredibly small with incredibly big implications. And I loved how it had this amorphous quality. And as soon as I picked up your book and I begun reading it, I saw it everywhere and the externalities of it too. And it became this thing that I was suddenly awake to.
Dust is this gift of a topic for a writer. I'm incredibly lucky to have found it because it is precisely something everywhere and incredibly familiar, while also just sneaking below the sort of the threshold of thought or conscious awareness a lot of the time, such that, there haven't been tons of other books about it before. And it's this chance to say something unexpected about the everyday, which is not easy to find. And I'm so thrilled that really I've sort of had this opportunity in my life and have been able to take it in that way.
It's perfect too, because I think that, you said something that it's very ordinary, right? There's a sort of mundane quality about dust as we perceive it in our everyday. And I've been thinking a lot about the mundane in my life, and how once I shine a light on the mundane, that all of these things start to unravel from it. And I think that was dust's other quality, is that as soon as you touch it, it feels like a substance that is interconnecting everything, and illustrating the complexity of our interconnectedness. I pulled this quote from the book because I think it touched something really lovely for me, which is, dust is a boundary crosser, a transgressor. The philosopher Michael Martyr calls it the breath of matter on the brink of spirit, both solid yet insubstantial, an element as much of air as it is of earth. Dust is matter at the very limit point of formlessness. The closest stuff gets to nothing. This paradoxical nature of dust is, of course, a main reason I am interested in it. How rich to think with a material that isn't one thing or another and doesn't stay where it's put. A substance that blurs boundaries and refuses black and white certainties for the subtleties of gray areas.
Thank you for picking that.
I loved this.
That is I like that paragraph. That's a really good one to capture the spirit of this thing. Like the contrast between something that is so absolutely everyday and familiar, and once you dig into it, you're like, wow, this stuff is weird, this stuff is fascinating, this stuff, into the dust under our sofa come, potentially space dust, potentially meteorite dust, potentially stuff from other planets, and the sense of enchantment in a way of the everyday, and horror, some big feelings come into that fuzz under your sofa.
That's perfect. One of the things that has come up a lot lately for me is that double-sided coin of awe and horror, that we can look with something and absolutely marvel at I think oftentimes right now it's largesse and its impact on the world, but also with awe at where it is. And you say this, that the dust underneath a doormat it contains the world, and not just our world, but maybe the dust of many worlds and of time too. That this is one more thing that I kind of want to introduce to people before we really dive in, is that in some ways this felt like the terminal end of the waste of all wastes, right? That as we've explored some waste streams on the podcast, dust is the sort of evidence of the entropic arrow of time as it falls apart, as everything falls apart, and everything will become dust.
Absolutely. It's dirt that's lost its name, dirt that's lost its origins, lost its specificity. It's no longer garbage or trash or the waste from this or that. It's just dust. Its origins obscured in that kind of sense. Yeah, that end point.
Yeah, and I think that makes it all the more unseen. It was really fun to pick up the book and find a familiar landscape, and I think that this surprised me initially. And you start dust in the Western United States, where I'm from. So I'm from Colorado, and I'm from High Plains Desert. And I think that I started thinking about dust very early on. My father grew up during the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma, and I had grown up in Eastern Colorado thinking about dust, and then entered into agriculture, which is a big creator of dust, and sort of sets off topsoil erosion at times, and maybe helps it at others if we're doing it in certain ways. And at the same time that there was this familiar landscape, you introduced concepts that were unfamiliar to me, and stories that were unfamiliar to me, both within the Dust Bowl and the Owens Valley, and wrote about how dust in many ways is a story about water in its absence. And so I'd love to tease out the relationship there between dust and water.
It's a funny one, because the geographies of water and water politics are some that I'm fairly familiar with and have studied. I had professors, and during my master's degree were water geographers. But I didn't actually realise I was writing a book about water, or the inverse, the opposite of water. What happens when the water is gone, the absence of water, and it's that consequences of that. It didn't fully dawn on me how central that was to my book until I gave it to my editor, and he's like, "Jay, this is water. Keep talking about water. It's actually so central here." And but that's writing about absence, writing about lack is a sort of a strange thing to do. It sort of sneaks in behind the threshold of your full awareness there. But there have been such brilliant books about water politics in the American West. I think I'm most familiar with the works on California, writing on the Dust Bowl as well. There have been Timothy Egan's book, What Have I Got? From Power on my bookshelf. Some really phenomenal works of scholarship. But what happens after that is the sort of the question I'm interested in there, and I think deserves some attention, because once landscapes have been desertified, or once the lake has dried up, the place doesn't stop existing. What happens next? And what can happen next? What can happen to those landscapes that are ravaged, that are not healthy landscapes? But I think it's really important to me as well that we don't talk about them as just like ruined, as of the past. I write quite a lot in the book about the Dust Bowl, because one of the things I learned was just how important the High Plains US was to America overall in the 1920s and 30s, that it was the centre of, economically, its role in farming was hugely important, but it was the sort of centre of the political imagination in the sense of what it meant to be America. The modernisation there, the improvements made in agricultural technologies, it wasn't an empty place, but quite the opposite. Now we talk about, you've seen headlines of course about sort of depopulation and decreasing population there, and sort of there's not much in the way of press coverage about the Oklahoma Panhandle or Kansas or so and so forth into the coastal media. But those places haven't stopped existing. Much the same with the Owens Valley. In California, once the water had gone, there are still people living there. There is still something happening. So it encourages us to take a long, long, long view. Hell to write with sometimes, because you want to begin a chapter 110 million years ago when such and such volcano erupted. Like, oh God, geological histories, But it encourages you to take a long view and not just sort of look at the moment of change or catastrophe, but to kind of go, how did that get here? What happened next? What could happen? What could happen in the future as well? How can these places be healed? They can never be restored back to where they were, but they can get a hell of a lot better. I think that's a really important message. And one I've been really, really happy to see has landed with readers. Could feel like you're writing a book about environmental disaster here. There is some apocalyptic scenes, the Dust Bowl fairly high among them, of course. These churning walls of dirt a kilometre or more high. What happens after that? Well, land regrows.
Psst. Hi. I want to talk about something really special graced my kitchen all through winter. And it was my culinary stories of Sundries Farm Garlic. And they are back this year with shipping starting in September for their culinary and seed stores of garlic. In the Hagerman Valley in Idaho, my friends Robert Kropfel, who has been on the show, and Jillian Lakuski, who might come on the show one day, farm garlic in rich volcanic soils. This isn't just any garlic, though. This is hand-grown and certified white rot-free garlic grown without herbicides or pesticides on a small family farm. Whether you're looking for seed garlic for next year's starts or culinary garlic to flavor your kitchen through winter, Sundries Farm has created something magical over the last 8 years. It's garlic packed with flavor with big seed heads, meaning whether you're buying it to peel and add to any dish or growing it yourself, you're getting both flavor and the ease, and let's face it, joy of big cloves. We all like big cloves, right? I've followed along Rob and Jillian's journey for over a decade, watching them infuse everything they do with quality, an unrivaled work ethic, seriously, and a whole heck of a lot of spunk. Whether they're smoke jumping, silversmithing, fishing, hunting, working dogs and horses, or farming, they're doing it right. And Sundries Farm Garlic is no different. With this garlic, you are not just getting certified disease-free garlic grown with the best practices overlooking the Snake River in Idaho. You're getting a story of garlic where every head passed through the hands of these farmers at least 8 times as it was planted, weeded, the scapes were picked, harvested, dried, trimmed, and then shipped to your doorstep. You're getting garlic where no chemical fertilizers were used, just blood meal, fish emulsion, and kelp. Garlic that is of the earth and for the earth. If you're buying seed garlic, expect varieties bred for their size and flavor. Hard and soft neck varietals like Music and Chilium, Early Italian, Persian Star, Nootka Rose, Purple Glazer, and so many more. You can find their culinary garlic in both soft and hard neck grab bags and buy it in bulk and store it for the rest of the year to add punch and spice and earth to your meals. All you have to do is go to sundriesfarm.com. That's Sundries, Sundries, farm.com to pre-order seed and culinary garlic for the year with shipping beginning in September. No code is necessary. Just have your hankering for some incredible hand-grown garlic ready and in action. Go to sundriesfarm.com. Yeah, there's so much I want to tease out. And the first thing I want to tease out of that is looking at some of these arid landscapes and seeing something that the way that we look at deserts as something that is done, that is ruined, that is past, is and seeing, again, not seeing them, that they become unseen, and that there is still life there, and that there is something that happens after the disaster, that happens after we have intervened, whether it's with a nuclear bomb or the diversion of water away from a landscape, or the invention of the plow and the way that it changed the ecosystem of the plains, that there is something that is continuing into the future, and we have to become stewards of that, and to begin to, and to borrow a word from you, to begin to look at what it would mean to perhaps not perfectly heal, but to salvage that space and to tap into the life that is still very much there.
Stewardship is such a great word. I probably don't use it enough, in fact, but I think it conceptually, I think it's an important term within regenerative agriculture, if I'm right. But it's that sense of recognizing human responsibility without hubris, isn't it? It's about saying that we have a responsibility here, but it's not a dominating word. It's a guiding word. It's a partnership word. And I think that's a critical, absolutely essential mental model in there. It's also maybe worth saying with some of these landscapes, it's not a standard place for a British person to have necessarily get really excited about, like, the Eastern Sierra, or Eastern California specifically, or some of the part, driving through parts of Oklahoma or Kansas or things like that. Not typical holiday destinations, it's fair to say.
No.
And I've really benefited from friends here, and I write them into the introduction for a reason, because this book wouldn't have happened without friends of mine. I talk about 2 guys who I first went to California and Nevada with. And I've also really learned a lot from a friend of mine called Joel Childers, who lives a bit north of Reno, who loves exploring the abandoned gold and silver mines of the Great Basin. And like, by riding along with him, I got a chance to go off-road, go into some fairly empty places out there, places you wouldn't normally see, you wouldn't normally know to go look at. And people's enthusiasm is infectious, people's sort of passions for places. It's contagious, it rubs off. And so through going out with him, he's a keen photographer, I'd be sort of assistant camera, holding the camera bags. Through that, you do learn to sort of spend some time in a place, watch the light change, think about where it's come from a lot, think about how it's changed over the years, and to develop a sort of affection. I write out of love. I really hope that's apparent. I write about places because I love them and I care about them, and I kind of want to communicate that to other people. It's not scientific rigor on that front. It's the travel where the passion comes through.
I think the passion comes through immensely, and I know that it was on that trip as you kind of traverse these landscapes that the idea of dust sort of began to come together for you. And I think that the best writing, and I think that the best science writing in particular is a marriage of what it is that we love and also data. It is qualitative as well as quantitative. And it is to feel that we are a participant in a space in the interconnected environment that we are a part of, even if it's temporary and we're passing through. That love can still develop and that care can still develop in that, and so it does come through, and I think that it's all the more beautiful for that.
Thank you. Am I right in thinking we both have anthropology degrees? Is there a bit of that going on here?
Yes, there is.
The insistence
Yes.
on the qualitative, the insistence that the experience of doing the research or being in the place, that the writer's experience is central to the story, that it's not more objective to take yourself out of there, because you need to show people the person doing some of the interpretation. You know, you don't want to bang on about yourself too much, right? But you do need to give a little bit of sense of the person who's telling you this stuff, because that helps the reader understand what they're hearing, the context of what brings you to it, I think.
It does. And I also think that it speaks to, in many ways, like dust. I mean, we are inextricably interconnected to this place. We are the cause of dust, and we are making more dust, and we are experiencing both. I don't want to put it in terms of black and white or good or bad, but we are experiencing a wide spectrum of impacts from dust that then change us. And I think that one of the things that the book does is it elucidates these feedback loops between us and our environment within this particle, within this particulate matter, and that we're all building on one another and interconnected and affecting all of these different spaces in ways large and small that reverberate throughout ecosystems. And I think that writing yourself into that is that we are a part of this place, and have reaching effects both in time and space.
Like, it's really important to me that the interconnectedness is not in the slightest bit metaphorical. You know, we inhale dust. What dust does to
Yes.
our lungs, the way smaller particles pass through our lungs into the bloodstream, into the brain, once we're talking about the really tiny, tiny ones, you know, it is physically in our bodies. Factual statement, microplastics, heavy metals, all the chemicals that ride along on dust as well. You know, it gets inside us. We aren't entangled in some sort of moral or metaphorical sense. It's the particles inside our bodies.
Yes.
That material reality is really, really straightforward and terrifying to think about, really quite frightening. And certainly dust impacts different people differently depending on where they are and what kind of air they're breathing in, but it does impact all of us. Absolutely every last one of us is inhaling this. There is no avoiding it. And there's a kind of that universality, that immediacy.
Mhm.
You know, everybody in the book. I mean, you hope. I don't want to make anyone afraid of inhaling. Please do continue to breathe. Very important. Please don't let me lose any readers through suffocation. But yes, what we breathe matters. You know, the air is the most important thing on this planet.
It's intimacy in many ways, and this is something I often come back to through the lens of food, right? Because our food becomes us, that these particles that break down in our metabolism and go through a one cell wall thick lining of our intestine then become a part of us. They inform us, and we have this constant exchange between plants where our carbon dioxide becomes their tissues, their oxygen becomes ours. And I think that dust speaks to a many-fold intimacy with our environment, both the built world that we have created in the Anthropocene and also the natural world. And it is both, and it is the product of all of these different spaces. And I loved that because dust also becomes us, and we are made out of these particles and places that are coming from far reaches and that have a lot of impacts, and so I do think that dust spoke to intimacy in a certain way.
So much. From some of the specifics, for example, atomic testing, nuclear testing, particularly the above ground tests, which took place from sort of 1945 through to, I think it was the early 60s, detonating bombs above the surface. And these might have happened in relatively depopulated places, significant consequences for people locally, but also the particles from that get into the airstream. They can travel across America in sort of 4 or 5 days. They can travel across the world, and they can get inside everybody's bodies. That the delayed death toll, the very, very slow cancer death tolls from nuclear testing, thyroid cancers, things like that, most visibly, that's one very specific event in time and history that gets inside our bodies. And in another way, there's also a lot of really emerging science about the impact of air pollution on the brain. Worth mentioning that I do count air pollution as dust when I'm looking at particulate air pollution. So this is the solid particles, whether it's from mineral dust, whether it's from roads, whether it's from cars, whether it's from carbon, from fossil fuel burning, forest fires, and so on and so forth. We call it air pollution once it's flying, and we call it dust once it lands on something, but it's all kind of the same particles, just different points in time. So, that air pollution is increasing research looking about what this does to the brain, that it's actually impacting, not just lung diseases, not just heart diseases once particulates get into the bloodstream, but crosses the blood-brain barrier, and the impact on things like dementia, the impact on Alzheimer's disease, and also I believe into looking at things ADHD, depression, some of the neurological consequences in here, that it's, I don't know, that seems almost more intimate in the way that it impacts our sense of self, which is a terrifying thing to say, but our environment and our cognition, our environment and our sense of self, these things are connected. As you give that brilliant example, of course, with food, we can recognize that the diet we eat might change our energy levels, might change the clarity or fogginess we have there. So too the air we breathe.
I love that you put that this might impact our sense of self and ourself and who we are, because I think that we are the environment, and that what this speaks to is that this dust is, the friction between everything we've ever made, and that becoming us, and that in turn creating a sense of care. The chapter on nuclear test sites, I just found incredibly impactful. And I think that, again, it's this place that we've put in unseen, and what is left. I was gonna pull out this quote really quick here, just to kind of talk about it. Most importantly, thinking with dust is, as always, political. It carries us beyond national borders to see the commonalities between nuclear tests worldwide. In their carelessness, the populations they deem expendable, and the colonial logics used to decide who that is. It turns our attention towards the question of who has to deal with what's discarded. That is, who has to clean up nuclear test sites, and who must live with nuclear dust in the long term. It might help us see the full picture, not just the glossy Life magazine photographs. Focus on the bomb and you miss the actual disaster. And I think some of what we were talking about with earlier, the what happens after, and the places that we sort of hide and ship things off to, so that we don't have to see their effects, are incredibly seen within the context of this book. And I kept returning to this idea of the unseen. You even, and I put this at the top of my notes, you said, I'm cautious of these words. Too often the promise of renewal is simply cover for shipping the problem elsewhere. That was one of my favorite little pieces, because I do think that this showed us where we where we ship problems elsewhere into realms that are unseen, into deserts that are empty, and then we ignore the literal and the metaphorical fallout.
I mean, nuclear waste is such a or nuclear what's nuclear infused landscapes perhaps is the phrase.
Mm.
The
Yeah.
ground in Australia, for example, where they did a series of atomic bomb tests in the desert, and the ground around the test site is sort of turned to glass and it is irradiated. And you've got this material. If you want to clear up the site, I mean, you still have to dig a hole essentially and put, a foot or two of topsoil and material at that point into a hole. It doesn't stop being radioactive at any point in time.
No.
It can't. It can just be one place or another place. Very similar with mining waste. In the Four Corners region of the United States and elsewhere, that the land sort of impacted by mines, the land impacted by nuclear testing, and of course nuclear waste itself, we can't make it disappear. There's this real, it's not powerlessness exactly, but there is a real material obstinacy, right? In this is nature or the material world just. We can't make the problem go away neatly. There is just only mitigation. There is only finding the least harmful solution, finding the least, it's all least bads, that situation is least bad rather than good. There aren't any great answers there. Remediation is incredibly expensive, potentially can be afforded. People did want to make that point in there, but it is billions of dollars rather than a couple of million here or there. The costs for decisions made decades ago are high.
Yes, and they've followed us. This idea that we were just testing a nuclear bomb. I had a moment when reading that chapter, right, that sort of removes us from the idea that this is still a nuclear bomb, that we are still irradiating all of this topsoil, that we are still mining uranium in communities where there is a lot of waste and a lot of dust that is harmful, and that sense of harm reaches far into the future as something that I think we have changed in so many different ways. It completely changed. That radiation will never leave us, right? It marked a different era, whether it was in an ice core or whether we now look for low background steel, right? There's such a low level of radiation that all metals have some of it, and for really fine instruments, you have to use low background steel that was produced prior to nuclear testing. But that this harm endures within communities and within people and lives that it continues to take into effect.
My mother is just turned 70 yesterday. Happy birthday, mummy. And she lives in Surrey in England, and she does Pilates. You've got to keep yourself limber in these days. And she does Pilates, and one of the other gentlemen in her Pilates class is about 85 or 87, I believe. And she was talking to him, and he sort of said, "Oh, I received a medal from the government the other day." What was it for, she asks. And to recognise that he was, as a soldier, conscripted in the 1950s, this would be, he was exposed to nuclear testing at Christmas Island, an island in the Pacific, which was, I think, then a British colony. And he was, a young man on a ship in cotton shorts and a shirt, told to cover his eyes, put his fingers in front of his eyes while a bomb goes off a couple of miles away. And there's been huge campaigning, a group called Lab Rats here, for nuclear affected veterans, have been trying to say that this was above and beyond the usual call of duty here, and this needs to be acknowledged by the state as an injustice, really. And so my mother's Pilates friend finally got his medal this point in time, and that's just, it happened half a world away, happened some sort of, 60, 70 years ago, but these things linger on.
Yeah. And you get I can't help but feel, oh, you get a medal, you get this consolation prize for this exposure to this material that fundamentally altered, in some way, something about you. at a genetic level.
It's interesting. I went to a conference for lab rats a couple of years ago up in Manchester, and everyone there is certainly very aware that the harms done can't be undone. But the sense of aggravation, that in fact it wasn't seen, was really, really difficult for these veterans and their families, that there was a sacrifice that they had made unknowingly, but that sacrifice had not been recognised by the government, that there were harms done, and they had just, that sense of being little people. There's a phrase in my book from a woman who called Mary Dixon, who was a downwinder campaigner, campaigner against the continued impact of nuclear testing in Utah. And she's just like, the attitude of the authorities those were just people in little Utah. Where's that? She says. They were Mormons and cowboys and Indians. Who cares? 18-year-old British military conscripts, much the same. Indigenous people in Australia, in Algeria, much the same. This sort of, and particularly in that, in the campaigning for nuclear affected people, you've got some really seemingly unusual allegiances between veterans, between Indigenous people, between Mormons, between rural people who are all been affected by this way. And they're all quite different populations, but they've all been seen as not important because they live in somewhere small and far away from the centres of power, and that's not right.
Did you... you did such a good job of seeing these unseen populations, and I have to ask if that was just... If some of that was baked into seeing dust, this unseen thing in the first place, or if that was something that you intentionally went in with this idea of seeing some of these unseen places and people that have been affected by dust.
Good question. What order did that happen in? It's hard to say. The book became more about Indigenous lands than I knew at the beginning. I think that's fair to say. Like, as I said, I have a degree in social anthropology. It's useful in enabling you to think about global scale histories and places that aren't in the usual history books and things like that, to be interested in what seem like remote or out of the way places. But so I was aware certainly about some of the environmental politics of these places, but like the water, these sort of threads draw themselves together as you write, and you realise, okay, it's not just in Owens Valley, in Payahunadu, and Los Angeles. It's not just that story, and it's not just the nuclear testing story, and it's not just one of these places. It's not the long history that produces the Dust Bowl. Keeps on happening in the same way, and you want to try and join those dots together and sort of say that to talk about, you end up talking about colonialism, you end up talking about settlers, you end up talking about core periphery relations become really, really central to the way of writing, actually, because I think in a lot of times I'm writing, it's not settlers as individuals causing the problem, it's a system of London, of Moscow, of Washington, D.C. against small and out of the way and rural places, and sort of the power politics of that. And, I came in knowing that was that sort of geography, that structure was really central to it. And then the specifics of who to be talking to and who were relevant kind of came through in the grassroots of going to places, reading the books, doing the research, recognizing what was important about each specific place, and to ground it in local realities is important. I don't want to write. There are some books, actually. Michael Marner, who you quoted from earlier, is a philosopher, and he writes this lovely book on dust that's completely different to mine, because he's thinking about it philosophically and sort of the role of, I can't quite remember, microscopes and vision and perception in there's Kant in there and all sorts of things, and it could not be less like my book. And we're both writing about dust, but so you bring in what you know already, you bring in what you're interested in, and I'm quite material. I'm interested in places, I am interested in specifics. I'm not sort of an abstract thinker, funnily enough. I write a book about dust and I'm like, things, tell me about things, tell me about places.
Which you do amazingly. You said in that bit that these things sort of keep happening again in similar ways, and that you're writing some about these structures and systems, and correct me if I kind of connected this too to modernity. And I think that one of the things that absolutely fascinated me with dust was this connection to the idea of, and you return to it time and time again. I mean, it's in the byline of the title, but I have all these quotes about modernity here because I think that it was really interesting to touch on this effect of modernity and our idea of progress and the way that we have attempted to control and to have these sort of linear ideas of asymptotic growth. And I think what has been done, at least from my view, in the name of that, and to call that progress, and then to have dust, which is so incredibly nonlinear and is made evident by the progress of our smooth surfaces of capitalism. Like that is a part of what illuminates dust. And to just really touch on modernity. I'm curious what brought you into weaving that theme in, and then maybe we can dive a little bit deeper into modernity.
So I think that's about looking for connections between places too, and to understand causes. And in individual place situations, we're talking about sense of. There's that sort of. Destiny and American exceptionalism and the frontier. There's that narrative. There is, of course, profit. The Dust Bowl in particular, and looking at agricultural profits that could be made by running the land too hard. Then you've got the atom bomb, and that's not about money, is it? There's a grand narrative of capitalism versus communism, kind of great power struggle that's driving nuclear armament. But okay, we've got capitalism sometimes, we've got colonialism sometimes, we've got this, we've got that. Like, there's something connecting these things, but what is the right word? And modernity seemed to be the precise term to use. What's the ideology behind why we might treat places like this short-termist, lack of consequences thinking? Sometimes it's capitalist, but equally I write about the USSR and in Uzbekistan. I don't write about it at length, but you also had a dust bowl essentially in Kazakhstan from the expansion of wheat growing, very, very structurally similar to what happened in the United States. Again, I don't fit it into the book, but you've got a number of examples from Africa as well, from Southeast Asia, from about soil degradation from the intensification of agriculture. And sort of you need something as big as modernity to talk about the shared values there, about relationship between people and land, about that nature is something to be exploited, that nature is something that can be controlled, that kind of straightforward linear top-down control can be achieved and things will get steadily better each year, rather than what I try to argue for, I think, is a recognition of, as we're talking about stewardship, is a recognition of our responsibilities, but also, we are very small and quite powerless compared to natural systems as well, and that we can't always have our way. We can't. You can't fight the nitrogen cycle, right? You can't fight. You also can't fight dust very terribly well. These things.
Nope.
They're not exactly bigger than you. They don't care. They don't care what you think you can do. They are just physical systems, and they will operate in their particular way. And you better respect them because they won't respect you otherwise. And that sense of modernity as the actor there, it also creates a space because we can talk about this is about high modernity in particular, that kind of early 20th century, or we might say sort of 1870s, 1880s through to the 1950s or 60s. It is actually quite a time-bounded period. I'm certainly not arguing against science, for example. I am certainly not arguing against Enlightenment values. It's an argument in favour of a more selective look at those things to say, what exactly do we take from that? More scientific purity, more scientific humility. And then also, to try and sketch a what next, because, particularly towards the end of the book, I'm talking to these NASA scientists doing absolutely cutting edge science to understand the Earth system science, to understand the role of dust within the planet as a phenomenally complex, interconnected system of water cycles, carbon cycles, mineral, geological, so on and so forth. And that's cutting edge science, absolutely. But it's also, they're interesting. They all talk about how interconnected it all is. They all come back to this, and they're using terms from ecology. They are speaking in a not dissimilar language to some of the indigenous folks I've interviewed, who also talk about, of course, the interconnectedness of natural systems and people within that. And it's like, there's, we took complexity science and increasing, what started off with some cybernetics, which was still a bit sort of command and control oriented, still a little bit pro-domination, I suppose, into recognition of complex systems and ecosystems and ecology, which is both science, but it's sort of a new science and a more sophisticated one, hopefully, that is better able to recognize the nature of the world we operate within.
That was so perfectly said. And I think that this was the first time, and I feel like I had been looking for a book that wanted to discuss some of the reasons that we had sort of driven forward this idea of progress in the name of making the world more controllable, the sort of idea of domination. And also you fold in the idea of cleanliness. You fold in, this idea of being able to eradicate certain things. And I think that that has very much driven that idea of separation, and then to bring it around to that sense of interconnected systems thinking, where you have an Earth that is interconnected, and all of those systems are interacting in a way that they are affecting one another throughout these incredible, fascinating, beautiful feedback loops, where the Sahara is providing a lot of the phosphorus for the Amazon, and an entire continent away, and the idea that dust is changing our climate based on its shape and color, and exactly what it's doing within the air. But I really, the aspect of modernity hit something very deep for me, just as what you said, as a way of connecting all of these sort of different political systems and different economic systems, as some of the reasoning behind what we do and why we do it in that way.
It's interesting. There's been a sort of, there are a number of friends of mine from London, people I have known for 10 or 12 years hereabouts, and we have all ended up writing books about this in some sort of way. There's a book you will love by James Bridle, Ways of Being. You will adore it.
I do adore
one of the most fabulous covers as well, which doesn't matter, but it's quite nice, isn't it, when they do? So James's book looks at sort of the entanglements of both more biological than mine, of ecosystems, of consciousness, of animal life, but also taking that through into AI and computational science and thinking about systems on those sorts of terms. And like me, James is sort of arguing that we're trying to critique simplistic or outdated notions of machine logic in a sense, but that doesn't mean in the slightest bit rejecting science or rejecting computational studies. It's about using what computational analysis, and in my terms, my NASA aerosol scientists using huge computational models that were absolutely technically impossible. Each sort of era of climate modelling is doing something that would have been impossible 5 years before. And we can only see dust, we can only think about dust, we can only measure dust because we now have computational power that starts to be able to look at the world, to sort of, to be able to break down the planet into small enough grid squares, to be able to slice up the atmosphere into different layers and to recognise, there's one thing going on down here, something else happening higher up in the atmosphere. And so it's computation that lets us see that, and that is a fantastic thing. And then also my friends Georgina Voss and Deb Chatra have books about infrastructural systems, which are fascinating. And again, that look about that intersection of complexity, about how systems work, and about where we sit within them, about how recognizing our agency within systems, recognizing that systems are often things that people make, that humans make, and that we have to, they're not just, infrastructure is not just something outside us or beyond us, but it's something we can shape and something we can use to make the world better.
Yeah, Deb is coming on the podcast in March. And so and I love James Bridle's book, and that is very much right up my alley. And
forgive me for not recognizing that you would of course have read it already.
No, you're fine. You talk about some modeling of systems within the book, and I think that this is a really beautiful place where we can't eschew some of what we have created within modernity for how it might be able to help us salvage some of what we have created with modernity. And I know that one of my really it's more of a textbook, but Friedrich Capra wrote a book called Systems View of Life. And in it, he sort of details some of the mathematics that gave rise to actually being able to model ecological systems, which are the hardest to model mathematically because they are so interconnected and complex. And I love when our own, because I think so often we want things to be simple, we want things to be contained, we want them to be clean, we want them to be tidy. And what ecosystems show us is that the mess is this beautiful complexity and interconnectedness, and we have to start thinking about how we build systems that are interconnected in that same way, and that consider all of the, or at least attempt to consider, and let me be really clear about that, attempt to consider all of the different multifactorial outcomes of any single action as humans, whether that's within an ecosystem or within a community or whatever that is, that it's not singular, that it's
Absolutely.
not this linear space.
The sense that the mess, the complexity is irreducible, that is the fact of the world. That it's interesting, it's almost a matter of our sort of intellectual intuitions here in a way, that you learn as a child, or the sort of the idea that truth is often very simple, and in mathematics, often is the case that the elegant mathematical proof is the correct one. But increasingly, I think with some of the Earth system stuff, it's like, no, it's complicated all of the way down. The entanglement, the non-linear dynamics that mean that small changes in original conditions can produce very disparate end results, and you can never measure the original conditions perfectly. All of that is intrinsic to the nature of the phenomenon being looked at. And so grey areas become a useful metaphor here. The idea of learning to think with uncertainty, it's part of thinking with dust. Something I try to develop is that sense of thinking quite probabilistically, to instead of yes or no, black or white, that this thing is, how confident am I in my knowledge, or how certain is this thing? And something might be 75% true, something might be 25% true. And to just sort of to hold in mind that there are maybe multiple possibilities in a situation. I find that idea of thinking with dust a kind of useful and extensible and a good lesson to take away, working with fuzziness of things, and to kind of sometimes letting that be. We want certainty in interpersonal relationships, let's say, but sometimes the not knowing is a fact.
You brought in something that was perfect within the book, because I think that thinking with dust and uncertainty, I think we are at a very uncertain point in time. And I think that where we go from here is uncertain. And I think our models will be uncertain. And I think that so much of this has that ring of uncertainty. And I think that on a more philosophical note, I think as human beings, anytime we're faced with uncertainty, sometimes we go back to that sense of wanting rigid control, that idea that we can have domination or power over an outcome. And I think that thinking with dust suggested that instead of looking for that, you look for the the interconnectedness, and to find, instead of these power structures, an interconnected web of care in the face of uncertainty.
One of the people I speak to and quote is a woman called Erica Thompson, who is a PhD in climate modelling. I think she worked on Atlantic storms, and she's a mathematician at University College London now, and she's written a book on modelling and the uncertainties in modelling. And I think, and I draw upon her work at the end of my chapter on dust in the Earth systems and dust in climate modelling to say that actually some of the uncertainties dust poses there are irreducible, that it is not necessarily possible to, if we knew more, we could then model it. The kind of complexities that it puts into models are so vast and so significant that no, there are just limits to modelling here. She argues that better and far more mathematically than I do, but that's the gist. And what I think is very important about what she says there is that what this means is we have to not be reliant on models or data to tell us how to act. The models in this case will never be 100% certain, and will never be, completely mechanically deterministic down to the last photon of consequence. We have to accept there is uncertainty there. We have to choose to act based on things like the balance of probabilities, or based on the idea that certain outcomes are so terrible that we should put in effort to avert them, even if they aren't certain. And certainly our political systems aren't well set up to work on that basis. That kind of precautionary principle is hugely important to, everything from health to ecological thinking, right? But to recognize, again, that sort of fuzzy, dusty logic. We don't know that this is certainly going to happen, but look, there's a 25% possibility there. That seems pretty terrible. Let's work to mitigate that. And so uncertainty isn't a reason not to act. And that is a really, really important lesson. And it's fantastic. It's fascinating to me how it comes out of, mathematics in a sense, and comes out of her very technical work. Perfect certainty isn't a fact of the world sometimes, and we need to think about action differently.
Yes. That was, I really enjoyed that little section around modeling. And I think in the same vein that you have uncertainty, you have these feedback loops. And I pulled this just since we were talking about messes and problems, because I think that it sort of builds in this. In the last chapter, you say that we must act in a world that is a mess and only getting more disorderly. Our planet is a mess ecologically, carbon dioxide levels climbing, the boundary of planetary systems being breached, and temperature ever rising. We're in a mess politically, whether you call it a polycrisis or a clusterfuck. You don't need me to elaborate. We're even in a tangle theoretically, the systems scholars argue. Every problem interacts with other problems and is therefore part of a set of interrelated problems, a system of problems. I choose to call such a system a mess, Russell L. Ackoff wrote in 1974. High modern rationalization got us into this predicament, but it doesn't get us out. We have to stay with the trouble, as Donna Haraway put it, or to think through the mess with the mess if we want a better view. This just delighted me. And I think that, again, so oftentimes in that same vein of simplicity, we think about problems simplistically, that there's this one piece, this one problem. And I think that oftentimes we then, as you put it, in the cautious of rewords, we ship the problem elsewhere and then pretend that it's not a problem anymore. And by doing that, I think we've created these problems that really build on themselves and are as interconnected as some of the systems that you're exploring within dust. And so we have this kind of mirror set up where you have interconnected ecological systems, and you have interconnected problem systems of politics and of modernity and of different communities, and they're kind of all converging in this one space.
Where do you start? I think that's a question a lot of us ask, a lot of us feel. We feel overwhelmed by, polycrisis, right? Clues in the name, it's big. And it is, it's messy and it's interconnected, and where do you begin? Where do you begin to get a purchase on it? And so there's an argument here for dust as method. I think what I'm saying is you want to start with, I think, material, physical realities of substances or particles or things. It's easy to get lost when talking about systems. Whereas if you start with, okay, what have we got maybe coming out of a specific factory, or what is going on with this particular river, or why is there this chemical in my sheep? That start with something really specific and then follow that thing. Where did it come from? Where does it go? What does it do? What does it connect to? And start from the really small and specific thing. Go on a journey with that thing. And that's a method of seeing the system. That's a method of trying to take these very big ideas and actually getting a sort of comprehensible, human-scaled thing you can hold in your mind, but also a thing that allows you to see where you might intervene or what might be done, rather than you can look at the plant as a whole and you're like, Jesus, right, where do what? How? But if the problem is not, how do I fix climate change? But, okay, we've got a dust problem in my town, or we've got, what's air pollution in my neighborhood, or something, or whatever the environmental, whatever the social, whatever the political issue might be, taking it down to kind of a smaller scale. What can I do locally? Because we all act locally. That's the only way we sort of can act, the immediate ripple out effect of things we might do and things we might change. And it gives hope. It gives hope that things might be changed. And it's one of the tensions of this book. I really didn't want to write a sort of disaster book that's just like, this is cataclysmic, what is to be done? And I talk in everywhere I go, people do have hope, or they don't have the luxury of not hoping. They are doing things locally and they can see how those ecosystems can be made better. They see how places can heal. They can see how people's health can improve once you take away sources of pollution. And, each of these things individually is a source of hope. None of them individually are enough. I still don't know how exactly to think about I'm locally optimistic in each of these places, if that makes sense. I can see that things have changed and are getting better. And there's amazing scientists at University of New Mexico thinking fantastic interconnected research and community outreach in terms of thinking about nuclear problems and health problems and physiology and engineering. And, there's so much great work going on by stuff that doesn't necessarily make national and international press, but should. So you can be very locally optimistic about that. And we just have to hope for a lot of local solutions to build. I mean, no, that's not kind of politically correct. There is, of course, a variable for transnational institutions and global scale lobbying and large-scale political activity, but that's difficult for most of us to affect. And I do think it is important to also look at these local and kind of medium scale interventions to recognize that change does happen, that it's not just some sort of slide down into the abyss. There are good people doing hard work and making things happen, and that's really important not to lose sight of.
You made such an anchor out of that within the book, and I think that as I've been exploring some of these topics, at times I feel overwhelmed by the largesse of everything, that it feels like something that is crushing. And it often comes back to, whether it's on the podcast or in the book, the idea of hyper objects, right? That just this sort of massiveness and looming quality. But within so many of the stories in the book, I think almost all of them, there is this grain of, you call it a discipline of hope, which I loved, because you also said that not hoping or despair is a luxury. And I thought that brought something back home for me. Like, to despair is a luxury, but when we have that discipline of hope and community action of really caring, you can begin to see shifts within some of these landscapes. And the book starts in the Owens Valley and it ends towards the Owens Valley too, with what is a really big shift. Maybe not a perfect solution, but something that has begun to shift and change that landscape in a positive direction.
Absolutely. So to summarize very briefly, the Owens Valley, or Paiute Hoodoo in the Paiute language, is an area in the eastern Sierra, kind of Yosemite, and go a little bit further east. And it is, there's a lake known as Owens Lake or Patsiata, which was drained to provide water to Los Angeles in the early 20th century. Dry lake beds become a huge source of dust. You've got tiny sedimentary particles that blow up in the wind, and it was the largest dust source in the United States. Just huge health consequences in the area, and a loss of a lake, which is important culturally, it's important socially as well. And in you've got the development of the environmental movement in the 60s and 70s. You've got decades of litigation. And as of 2000, there's a requirement on the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power that they have to engage in dust control works to stop some of the dust. And so there's a $2 billion building site, essentially, on what was the dry lake bed, doing different dust control methods, using different sort of shallow flooding, gravel techniques to stop the surface of the lake bed being able to lift up in the air. And it's not a natural place. As I say, I call it a building site because it does kind of look like one, except now actually it's filled up with water quite extensively from heavy snowfall last winter. But it's not a natural place in this sense, but the levels of dust have come right down. It's very, very close to being in attainment, as the terms say. And meanwhile, the birds came back. The birds just saw you just add some water, and the birds that migrate up the west coast were like, hey, it's got brine shrimp. Brine shrimp are tasty. They're flying a long way. We need to go and eat me some brine shrimp. They descend in their tens of thousands, and they meet sort of within a decade, this place becomes, from desolation, becomes a sort of bird reserve, becomes this fount of life. It's not the unspoiled place it once was. There used to be a steamboat that crossed the lake. It used to be sort of 20 or 30 feet deep. But it is still full of life, and it is a hell of a lot less dusty. And that's what can happen, and that's what can be done. And it changes so fast. This was the other thing that really struck me. And this is water again. Just add water, and these places spring back into life. And they don't actually it can take decades to cause the damage. And then water in a few short years can cause ecosystems. There are seeds that lie dormant. There are seeds buried in the ground. Plants come back. Birds are opportunists. And if they see a shrimp, they'll eat it. It's good. It's astonishing that there is a sort of vitality there that's pretty unsquashable. And that is something I think you can have a lot of faith in. That's something you can believe in. You just have to give nature a chance sometimes, and she'll really surprise you.
Yeah. I've seen this time and time again in certain agricultural spaces that change can happen really fast, and in the face of destruction that took a significant amount of time to make. And I think that again, tells us there's a pleasant sense of smallness within that we both have the power to change things rather substantially, and we don't, and it is outside of any power that we've had. And as soon as you just a little bit of water and something comes back to life. And I think that in the book you refer to this as salvage, and you talk about the word salvage, and I really loved this, because I think that so often within the realm of looking for solutions, again, we see that sort of perfect, unmarred surface that I think we've inherited from ideas of capitalism and of progress. And you say instead, and I'll read a little quote about this. The word I've come to think with is salvage. To save something valuable or important from disaster, a rescue carried out in difficult conditions, a rescue that may not completely succeed, but you do what you can anyway. To salvage a difficult situation isn't to solve it, but to fight to avert failure and strive for even a crumb of something better. An architectural word for reusing and repurposing, for bricolage, jagad, hacks. It's a word halfway between salvation and garbage, as the writer China Miyavi might be pronouncing that wrong, told the Boston Review in 2018. This shit is where we are, a junk heap of history and hope. It's a word for difficult times, Miavia explains. Times when we fear it's too late to save, but we might repurpose. Suturing, rigging, cobbling together, finding unexpected resources in the muck, using them in new ways, a strategy for ruination. A lesson that it is worth fighting, even for ashes, because there are better and much, much worse ways of being too late. It is worth fighting, even, perhaps especially, amid the dust.
That phrase of his, it's worth fighting even for ashes, I found that pretty early on, and that was just emblazoned across the top of the chapter. It's just this sort of North Star that you steer towards in your writing, that this... that is what we are trying to do. That is what I am trying to say. And yeah, love that phrase.
I think we get lost in that, though, right? I think that overwhelm, that largesse that presses in on us, where there are all of these problems and none of them have clear solutions, is that you lose that desire to continue to fight. And so to bring that back into both a smaller space and to remove some of that perfectionism and to invite people to go in, even if it's ashes, even if it's dust. Like, there is still so much that's worth saving here, and there is still so much life in those unseen places. Like, we might look at this place in time as being ruined in the same way that we see nothing in a desert, and then to go and to realize that there are all of these seeds of life, and that a desert is in itself teeming with life, and that there are people and traditions and communities left behind that are still there to start something in a shift, to be there with the shifting scape. Yeah.
The hope comes from your relationships, and that's relationships to community, and that's relationships to place. And I think a reason that a lot of the people I spoke with, were sort of able to be hopeful, because they had a deep relationship with a particular place. They weren't just thinking they weren't getting overwhelmed by a global picture, because they were focused on something very real and specific. And perhaps those of us in cities in particular, who are maybe not as bound to a specific landscape in some ways, we lose sight of that, and you end up thinking only at the kind of the abstract level, and maybe not getting your fingers dirty, getting down into the dirt, and kind of connecting with specific places or communities, that enable you to see what changes, to see the impact of change, and to remain materially grounded in the specificities. Not I don't know that it's good for us to kind of solely abstract things. At that point everything is overwhelming, but the hope is specific, the hope is material, the hope is quite local.
I love that. I've been thinking a lot about how we are of place, and I think that the big move into urban centers definitely does shift that sense of place, and you have a lot of the population of the world living in more urban places. But I think historically we've always had that sense of both being literally made out of place in the air we breathe and the food we eat that is attached to a place, but also being connected and rooted into a place, and feeling that sense of locality. And I have questions about how I've lived both in cities and much more rurally, and I have questions about how we can create that sort of more rooted connection, that material connection to hope within urban environments.
Oh, absolutely. And it was something I, struggle might be pushing it, but certainly I live in the city, I live in London, and I am somebody who cares about specific places and goes back to particular places, both within the UK and internationally. But I don't have the relationship to my part of London that's quite as rich as it could be in some sort of ways. I wonder about where I will end up in, another decade. Where do I want to live? What kinds of places to root myself within? I've got a great community on my little street. My street is very sociable on that front. Goodness, there's some good stuff in my region. But yeah, it's one of the places in the UK actually I'm particularly interested in is the Lake District up in the northwest of England. And you've got some brilliant farmers up there, particularly around the writer James Rebanks, who is also a best-selling author, and his wife, who's also actually a best-selling author. They're quite a remarkable couple. But their work there is about water. It's one of the wettest places in the country, so quite different to the landscapes I write about. But the regenerative work there is about slowing how water comes off the hills so that it doesn't flood. And there's been work to re-wiggle the landscapes to actually take rivers that have been canalized and that have been sort of, there've been an emphasis on draining the land and speeding up water flow, but that just speeds up flooding. And so the regenerative work there that a lot of farmers are doing are rebuilding floodplains, letting the rivers wiggle slowly, building ponds, building marshy areas. And again, changes there have happened in less 5 years, very, very quickly. The river gives a chance to wiggle again, and the river very happily slows down and starts building up its natural sort of mud banks and gravel banks, and the plant life grows back. And some of these people's farms have changed in 5 years, 10 years, if that. Absolutely fantastic. And I mean, there's a lot of policy problems in terms of funding all of this and our environmental subsidy schemes and all of that sort of groundwork. Apologies to American readers, it's not necessarily any better over here. It's very, very, very tough. But a lot of good people fighting a good fight. Really small scales, like these really valley level ecosystems. We've got a complete hydrological systems there of, the water comes off the hills and it's all your farmland and you can do something about that in that sense. I love the changes I'm seeing. That's really, really exciting.
Yeah, there's a sense of agency there that I think is really beautiful, and that interaction and seeing it on these sort of smaller scales of time. One thing I was going to ask, as we sort of talked about the coming back to a more local sense of care, is also dust played so much with time for me. It felt like it bent time in many ways, that it was a measurement of time within ice cores, but that it was also, I mean, you think about the cosmic dust and being able to actually measure the Big Bang, and you also think about how everything becomes dust given enough time, and thinking, especially within the Owens Valley and the Paiute tribe, there was a lot of thinking on that more 7-generation scale of thinking into the future, that this care has to extend well beyond, and that I think so much of modernity has taken a right now, what is best for right now, that whether you're talking about the Dust Bowl and sort of the extraction of fertility from the plains was good for right now, and it was the extraction of the water from the Owens Valley to build Los Angeles was good for right now. And I mean the same in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, where you have the cotton farming that is drawing off the water from the Aral Sea. And so I wonder how that marriage of sort of locality, but on a much longer time scale, how we might think about that, or how you think about that.
Dust and its paradoxes. You've got to have my cake and eat it. We keep local, but extremely not. And this sort of superimposition of time, in particular, the sense of the deep past remains very relevant now. For example, with some of the Dust Bowl lands, why does that land become dust so easily? It's because it's made of lowest rock that tens of millions of years ago was ash from a volcano. So it's not, igneous rock that's all glued together very well. It's squashed volcanic dust. So it doesn't take so much wind. It doesn't take so much effort for it to turn straight back into dust again. So it brings tens of millions of years of history together, sometimes even more. I don't write extensively about space dust in the book because basically I had to stop somewhere. It would have been fun.
It was good to stay on Earth. It was good to stay on Earth.
I think that was a good call. Earth, exactly. Some people are like, why aren't these other things in here? And it's like, did you want a 600-page book? Because my editor didn't.
But I might have.
Well, lobby her share and see if we can get another one. it is excess of this, things that happened that massively long ago, geological facts that have immediate bearings on the now. But also to recognise that we are making geology. It's one of the sort of tenets of Anthropocene thinking. That
Yes.
whether it is the sort of nuclear layers, but whether it's just a sort of physical transformation of the Earth systems launched by large-scale agriculture, industry, and 8 billion population. What we're doing to the carbon cycles and nitrogen cycles. It's not just a now. It is also a sort of layers of geological record. Ice cores became a particular object of fascination for me because they are, so remote and so elusive. You've got to go to Antarctica, you've got to go to Greenland and drill for 3 kilometers. This is staggeringly difficult to do.
Yeah.
And then at the bottom of that, you find dust alongside gases and debris from 100,000 years ago, and that helps you understand the ice age before the last ice age. It helps you understand interglacials. It helps you understand how climates of the systems can move sometimes, locally in those, but I say locally, sort of, Greenland scale locally, but can move sometimes incredibly fast during a period of the Younger Dryas. There's this kind of regional changes in temperature of, I think, 8 or 10 degrees in a space of a span of about a decade, and helps you it's understanding an ancient history as this means to potentially understand a future, to understand, to be able to improve our abilities to model what might happen in the century and centuries ahead. And again, that's a compression of past and future, deep past, not so distant future. But the two things speak to each other. It's not as if they're sort of, the past isn't dead and the future is here now.
Mm. I love that. The past isn't dead and the future is here now. And I think you saw that, and I just have to bring this in, that you can see the minting of money, the way that the byproduct of different metals being smelted, and what that said about the rise and fall of various entities throughout time.
Oh yes, one of the all-time great pieces of dust research, that one. So to explain a little bit, this is from looking at ice cores in Greenland again, if I remember correctly, and it's looking at lead. And lead has been carried in air pollution, how the lead levels change through period of time. And you get that scientists are able to see that this sort of rises and falls at a period 1800 or 2000 years ago and they're like, what's going on, where this lead is from human activity. Nature doesn't put a huge amount of lead into the atmosphere, but silver smelting and metallurgy, working with mineral ores, does. And they end up figuring out this is connected to the price, this is connected to the Roman Empire's economy and how much silver they are needing to mine and how much money they are needing to make in Spain in 200 CE or thereabouts, related to the fortunes of the Roman army and how many soldiers you have to pay and how much literal physical currency is needed. And the spikes, because of course an ice core is incredibly, it's really precise resolution. That's why they're so astonishing, that each year's snow captures it in sequence and traps that year's atmosphere and traps that year's dust as distinct from the next. So it means, you can reconstruct events from hundreds or thousands of years ago on a year by year scale, which, lots of other, other forms of record have not got that quite that level of specificity. And so you can actually look at it about progression of, Roman wars and the Roman economy. And it's like, mind blowing. I mean, as a lesson in how we are connected, then that really is.
Absolutely. And I think it also illustrates, you said before that we are changing geology in a lot of ways, and goes back, we are terraforming the planet in search of various materials, I think, and really changing that geology. And it's worth peeking at, and I think worth exploring in a lot of different ways. This has come up on the podcast in a myriad of ways. I mean, even just been thinking a lot about. I did a podcast with Ben Goldfarb, who wrote the book Crossings and a book Eager about beavers, and just how much the eradication of beavers in the United States vastly changed everything about our geography, but also about our water systems.
Beaver scene. You got they're doing their little bit to to cause these enormous impacts. They're fantastic, isn't it?
They're amazing, and they have their own ways of changing geological sense of things, and redirecting water, and creating deposits of sand that are later mined or bring in fertility, whatever it is. But that we are changing the shape of things. And I think that this brought in really acute and specific awareness of that change, and that change through both locale and time, like we just talked about.
It's a desire to kind of just to map where we are and what we're doing, and a recognition that, as people who, as somebody who benefits from that prosperity, bluntly speaking, as somebody who is a Westerner and is reasonably comfortable and has an iPhone and has the technologies that has those things enabled by mineral supply chains, and that my life and my comfort is not just a sort of a given, it is a material consequence of supply chains and systems and physical changes to the planet, and where I sit is connected back to all of these things. And there's also a lot of good work going on around clothing, actually, particularly, as well as a way of recognizing our position within supply chains. And a lot of people at the moment are thinking about how we can be more sustainable in our consumption there, and make reduce the impact of decisions we barely think about. Do I buy a new T-shirt? But it's it all traces along. Not least, actually, that cotton is an incredibly water-thirsty crop. Grows very well in deserts. So as long as you can dump enough water on top of it, it will grow in all sorts of places, which makes it appealing if you want to make a lot of profit. But requires emptying rivers. That's, as you mentioned earlier, that's how the Aral Sea got dried up, was the growth of cotton production from the 1920s and 30s through into the 1970s. And it's demand for cotton for Russia to match and to clothe its population and to equal America, dries up dries up the fourth largest lake in the world. And talk about terraforming.
Yeah, the fourth largest in the world. That really struck me, and disappeared in a very, very short amount of time. And I think that also speaks to a lot of, when I think about California grows the majority of the food for at least a big share of the food for the United States. And speaking about cotton growing really well in a desert, because that is a sense of having almost a control and an experiment, that you don't have to worry about there being too much water, which is, in theory, harder to mitigate. And so you just add whatever water you need, and you have this perfect, I'm putting this in really big quotes, climate in which to grow something. And I think that we pick the deserts the world over. I think that California is more visible, especially to us here in the United States. But we sort of outsource that sense of fertility, or our clothing, or these things that aren't being produced here at home. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is that we see food more easily within the supply chain, or we think about it. And I don't know if that's because we have a certain intimacy with it, or because we feel like we have a hope of knowing where it comes from. But so much of our surroundings, whether it's the cotton in our shirts, or it's the cobalt in our phones, or it's the sand in the glass in our phones or our screens or our windows, or the silicon chips, is something that we can't see, and we offload into these unseen places.
I think sand is a really good comparison there, actually. The other thing that fascinates me is alfalfa, which appears to be a
Oh,
hazard across the American West. Now, you will know more than me. I'm sure listeners here, please correct me if I'm not fully up on this. But because those things, we don't consume them directly. They're ingredients to make something else. Sand goes into grass, alfalfa goes into cows, right? And it's, America is just kind of exporting water. It's ancient aquifer paleo water. Quite a finite resource is being used to grow, not tomatoes or something that at least has some sort of direct benefit. It's being used to grow alfalfa that's then being shipped internationally. And surely alfalfa might grow somewhere else as well. This water is as precious as gold. And
yes.
a commodity crop like alfalfa is not necessarily the best use for it. Let's keep a little bit more of it in Salt Lake.
No, I and what you're speaking to, and I'll probably get some of the. So there's a township in Arizona that is growing alfalfa for Saudi Arabia predominantly, and it uses 50,000 gallons of water a year, I believe, which is enough to support a sizable municipality. Not that I think that we should necessarily be putting new cities in the middle of the desert either, but all of this is going to water alfalfa that we then export. And this is water that is either it's paleo water, as you said, it's groundwater, or it's coming off of the Colorado River, which is now on a 100-year end contract between 7 states, including California and Arizona. And it is wild to think about that water, and you say this really well in the book, and especially towards the end, it is the resource, and it is life. It is a life powerful resource. I have a quote in here, but I think that is. Let's see if I can find this.
I mean, I think it's as simple as water is life. That's the phrase that people keep using.
Yeah.
Particularly Indigenous folks and people I'm speaking to in Owens Valley, and the phrase used in some of the Black Rock Reservation and so on, and the protests there, that water in these watersheds circulates, and even if it is being pumped from groundwater and is going into a crop, it then soaks back into the soil again, and you can have some sort of recirculation into a river system. And to fully extract that wholesale and literally ship it abroad is a sort of does strike me as a risky intervention at a systemic level, very, very short term, as a move there, that there is not more water going back into these aquifers, that the 100-year rain forecasts for the West don't necessarily look strong. It's incredibly precious. Let's conserve every drop. Let's use it very carefully. It's very precious stuff.
I think that you touched on the idea that it's unimaginable. It was sort of unfathomable to me that we would pick this crop to grow with it and then export it, and and I think it also speaks to what we said earlier, that you have these systems, these structures, these ideas in place that we keep kind of finding ourselves in the same spot. And as we begin to kind of wrap up, I think that one of the things I've been asking myself is how we recognize that spot that we're in, that how we begin to see that pattern of extraction, of exporting and importing fertility, Heather and Jan, and of sort of putting it on these, you call them the hinterlands, which I loved, the sort of idea that we import fertility from places that are unseen, and we just keep doing it. And I think that to break the cycle is to see it, and to begin to, you use the word witness in the book, which I really liked, to see that this is a part of a structural and systemic pattern.
And to recognise it can be done differently in most instances, that there is probably a less damaging use of that land, there is probably a shift in crops, there is something that can change in these things, and nothing is set in stone. I mean, I think what gets quite apparent in agriculture is if we don't change things now, it is going to be forced upon us. It is going to be the water, certainly in parts of the high plains, that aquifer is draining, the water will just run out. That I mean, there's a sense that it already is mega drought in that season, but rains will not come. There will not be a choice. And you can either start to grapple with that now and start to set things up for the next 50 years, the next 70 years. People say, if you want the future for farms for your children, for the generations after that, or they will have to make those decisions themselves. There is not a sustaining of extraction. This physical, we're talking just hard physical limits of physical systems here. It's not negotiated. We can't negotiate. Consequences come due.
Yes, but as you said, and as you said at the beginning, there is a different way of doing this, and I think that is something that I keep coming back to, and that isn't always well illustrated, but Dust really illustrated it. It's this idea, my friend James calls it a sort of ability to tell ourselves a new story. We have been telling ourselves the story for so long, and we have the capability to change and to shift that storyline, and that reaches into the future, and I think carries with it too the past, and I think that is where Dust has those two things come together, that we can begin to shift this, that we can change our relationship to this, that we can break that cyclical pattern.
So if we look back at how some of these landscapes worked historically, what crops grew on them naturally, how people occupied them in a dry year, all of these sorts of questions, there are clues within that to what the sustainable use can be in the future as well. Be that patterns of irrigation, be that crops, be that livestock, or what's best to grow on the land, be that where people find themselves within a landscape. But for the past gives us lessons to the future that it shows that other ways of being have been possible and can be possible again. I think that's also something to take. The past isn't past, as we've been saying.
Yeah. Past isn't past, and I think one of the things I really want to take away is that sort of discipline of hope, and to come back to being able to trace what you can in your locale, in your community, and that change happens faster than you might think at first blush.
That's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. And I just want to thank you immensely. I really mean it when I told you earlier, and I don't want to offend your British sensibility, but it was a bit of a gobsmacker, this book. And it really did change something pretty big for me. And so I want to encourage everyone to read it, and tell us where. There will be links to the book in the show notes, but where else can we find you? Because this isn't all that you write about. You have some really beautiful musings on sort of the intersection of technology in these places too, and of intelligence.
It's been the main thing I've been focused on for some time. So it's been the focus of that writing. I'm just about starting to think about what I might write about next. I mean, I come back to the Southwest. I'm interested in the Salton Sea. I'm interested in lithium. I'm interested in Salt Lake. I love a dried up lake bed. What do you do? It's a strange passions we find ourselves with in life. But I love a terminal basin. They're great. They're fascinating.
I love that.
Who knew?
Who knew?
Nerd.
No, I know. I know. Well, I mean, I love supply chains, and that's not again. These are things that I surprise us later on in life.
Yeah. I've just been updating my website. So jowens.me is still the place to link there. I need to change one URL, which if I'm organized, I'll manage to do tonight, so that my Google links don't entirely break. But that's a place to link to. Now there's a thing called Other Writing, which is a place to signpost in there. And then I need to get back on and finish an article I am supposed to be writing about Salton Sea, in fact. So fingers crossed that's out next week.
Fantastic. Well, we will link to all of that so people can find you. And I've recommended the book a lot already, and I can't wait to share this with everyone. And I'm so appreciative of your time. So thank you for coming on.
Oh, God, thank you. And it's been fantastic. I love having the space for nice, expansive conversations. It's a bit of a luxury. Sometimes you hop on, you're on radio, and you've got 5 minutes, you've got to hit your sound bites. But it's nice to be able to talk more widely and with somebody who's read as widely as you have. And you've spoken to everybody. You get some great guests. It's terribly impressive.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And I agree. I tell everybody I'm a long format girl. I don't really know how to keep it short. And this is such an expansive topic that I wouldn't want to keep it in too small of a space. So
I know. Been an absolute pleasure. So you have a fabulous afternoon.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. If what you found resonated with you, may I ask that you share it with your friends or leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts? This act of reciprocity helps others find Mind, Body, and Soil. If you're looking for more, you can find us at groundworkcollective.com and at Kate_Kavanaugh, that's KATE_KAVANAUGH on Instagram. I would like to give a very special thank you to China and Seth Kent of the band All Right for the clips from their beautiful song Over the Edge from their album The Crucible. You can find them at All Right on Instagram and wherever you listen to music.